Good morning. I am Michael Poppa, Executive Director of the Mainstream Coalition. And on behalf of myself and our team, thank you for joining us for Mainstream Live, our series of conversations with figures in Kansas politics, advocacy, and community building. For over 25 years, Mainstream Coalition has been advocating for common sense government and healthy communities in Kansas. You can learn more about Mainstream and our body of work at mainstreamcoalition.org. And while you're there, please consider joining. Each membership contribution goes a long way to supporting our advocacy and outreach efforts across the state. And now, I would like to introduce my guest, Kansas Representative Nancy Lusk of the 22nd District. Representative Lusk, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for being here with us today. How are you holding up?
Oh, I'm doing fine.
Good, good. Glad to hear it. Well, we have a really complex topic to talk about today. So I really want to just kind of jump right in. We're going to be speaking about the recent resolution to amend the Kansas Constitution and the current House current resolution 5019 and Senate concurrent resolution, I cannot speak today, 1613.
Yes.
Representative Lusk, would you mind giving us a little background on these?
Yeah, I'll give you, it was really the dominant issue of the session, even though it didn't pass because Senate President Susan Wagle made it known that Medicaid expansion would not even be debated on the Senate floor if it didn't pass. And then to a lesser degree, on the leadership on the House side also held up legislation and in part for leverage on this issue. And so for a real brief background, last year in 2019, the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that a woman does have the right to an abortion in Kansas. And it's part of a bigger case that I won't go into details about, but as far as the right to abortion, they looked at our Bill of Rights, the Kansas Constitution, and they found that each person has a natural right of personal autonomy. And because of that, individuals have the right to make decisions regarding their own body and their health care. And that was the basis for it. It was a ruling of 6-1. And at the same time, it's no secret that the US Supreme Court has changed in its makeup. And there are now, there's a majority of pro-life kind of so-called judges now on that court. And it's only a matter of time, most people expect, before Roe versus Wade is overturned. And kind of in reaction to those things, pro-life advocates brought forth an abortion amendment to the state constitution. And although it was I think it was deceptive in how it was worded. It was kind of cleverly written because it says there's no right to an abortion in Kansas, and they didn't have any exceptions. In effect, there were no exceptions for rape, incest, or to save the life of the mother. But it talks about those exceptions in the language, but it just kind of suggests that, well, in the future, there's nothing prohibiting the legislature from putting those exceptions in. And then they kind of disingenuously claim that, well, if this passes, it's really not going to change anything. Well, that's only because Roe versus Wade is still in existence. And once it's gone, it will change things. So, and we know that the proponents didn't want those exceptions because, for one thing, when it was debated in the Senate, on the Senate floor, an amendment was offered by Senator Hensley to put those exceptions in, just to really clarify it so there's no confusion, exceptions for rape, incest, to save the life of the mother. And it was promptly voted down, and because they want the total ban.
Well, and they expected everyone to trust that the legislation or the legislators would know best, right? Would know best in the future about women's health care and reproductive rights.
Yeah, and I think they just prefer the total ban, and it's a ban that would outlaw most forms of birth control.
Right.
And I just think that, like the exception to save the life of the mother is critical. We heard that in the hearings, testimony about that. There were.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ahead. I was going to ask some of that testimony that was against the amendment was from OBGYNs, correct?
That's correct. We had a record number. We had 8 who gave testimony, and 4 of them came and gave it in person, which is really saying something because with their schedules, it's hard to get the time that they could come and do that. They wanted us to understand that there's just a wide spectrum of things that can go wrong in a pregnancy, life-threatening things, like kidney failure, severe lung disease, seizures, blindness, strokes, or the sudden death of the fetus. To relate one story, Dr. Angela Martin came and she told about a couple she called Aaron and Jake. And Aaron and Jake, they had been trying for a long time to get pregnant. Finally, after 2 years, they went and saw a specialist, and then they were pregnant, and there was never a more desired pregnancy. But unfortunately, the ultrasound at 20 weeks revealed that the baby had no amniotic fluid. So Dr. Martin remembered when she walked in the room, Aaron and Jake were talking about the nursery design. And she was about to tell him the diagnosis. And the baby had bilateral renal agenesis. I'm not sure if I say it correctly, but basically it means the baby had no kidneys and his lungs were not going to develop. It was a lethal diagnosis, and she was just about to shatter their whole world, with that information. And when I hear stories like that, I really get upset with the false narrative that some pro-life people put out, that the problem is there are all these abortion industry profiteers, and they're just talking women into abortions to make money, or that women are just making frivolous decisions late in their pregnancies, that they don't want to be pregnant anymore. And it's not like that at all. I mean, they are, the stories were heart-wrenching about their patients. So when you look at what really happened, the narrative is just so offensive to me. And as Dr. Martin explained, only a small, tiny fraction of all abortions even happen in the second half of pregnancies. Dr. Martin said that it's 1.3% of abortions happen at week 21 or after. So it's almost 99% happen in the first half. And well, here's another story that Dr. Martin had. She talked about a patient she called Katie, and Katie and her husband were very happily expecting their baby. They lived in a rural area. They had to travel, make trips to Kansas City to see the doctor. And unfortunately, when Katie was about 20 weeks along, she was diagnosed with a partial molar pregnancy. The fetuses of partial molar pregnancies do not survive. They cannot survive. Even if they manage to survive long enough to be born, they die shortly after birth. And the condition can cause strokes and seizures in the mother. And Katie's blood pressure was extremely high. It was so high that it was causing her kidneys to shut down. Her life was at risk, and the baby she was carrying was not going to survive. And Dr. Martin said she would never forget what Katie said as she signed the consent form for the abortion. She said, "I am pro-life, and I never dreamed I would be making this decision." Her abortion was performed at 21 weeks, and it saved her life. If I could, just one more story, because it makes sense.
Of course. These are definitely exclusion.
Another physician, Dr. Chetio.
Reasons that they should be. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I'm saying these are the reasons that the amendment failed in the Senate.
Yes, yes. Well,
in the House, at least. I'm sorry.
Well, no, these are the reasons why the amendment.
At least for those. Yeah, at least for those.
This was a big reason. The exceptions were a big reason. Even though it passed the Senate side, they were a big reason why it failed on the House side.
Correct.
Dr. Chettiar had a story about a woman who had come that she saw at a local hospital. And the patient came in and her water had broken and she wasn't even halfway through her pregnancy. And she unfortunately developed a very severe infection. Meanwhile, she had kids at home that she wanted to return to. And the expertise of every doctor, who saw the case said that the likelihood of the baby to survive was 0. And that the longer she waited, the pregnancy went on, the greater the likelihood that she would die from the spreading infection. So, and then Dr. Chettiar explained that sadly, instead of the doctors and the patient coming together to decide the best course, the safest course of treatment for the patient, the doctors were off talking to attorneys to figure out if they would be breaking the law if they tried to save her life. And the doctor made the further point that this is by no means an anomaly. She explained that every OBGYN has faced situations where the legal restrictions to terminating the pregnancy has put a mother's life at risk. And that was why she so strongly felt like the decision of when and how and for whom an abortion can be provided should be made in the exam room and not on the legislative floor. And they asked the legislature to please protect access to abortion as a fundamental right for all the women who will be in similar situations in the future, their future patients.
Powerfully heartbreaking stories.
Yeah.
And after that testimony, the Kansas City Star then ran an editorial, I believe, and it labeled.
Yes, it was in reaction actually to my testimony. I also gave testimony at the hearing because.
Yes. And they labeled your testimony. Well, first they labeled all testimonies from both sides, as I recall, boilerplate and not serious. But then yours specifically, true but irrelevant.
Yes, true but irrelevant.
True but irrelevant.
Yes. So the good thing about it was kind of a mild criticism, but they said it was true.
Right.
But when the Star comments specifically, then it opens up the opportunity, and so I got to write my own op-ed in reply, and it wasn't irrelevant because I had to look up the term boilerplate because it's kind of an old-fashioned term, but basically it means same old, nothing new, same old stuff. Right. And my counter argument was, no, this was brand new. I've been in the legislature for 8 years, and no one had ever brought the pro-choice Christian point of view before and explained it. And I finally kind of realized this year, well, I better do it because, if I want it done. And so that's what my testimony was about, kind of branched into a whole new area that hadn't been really brought forth before. And so I was happy to write that.
It is a side that's not often heard. And I said, is it a side that's not often heard? And you did receive feedback on that. Particularly, I'm going to share my screen for just a moment. One email of note that you received from a reader. Can you see that on screen?
Mm-hmm.
I'll read it just in case. Ms.
Okay.
Lusk, for 40 years, I have been firmly pro-life. I have waited with all the open-mindedness I have to hear someone explain the pro-choice position with philosophical clarity. That kind of discussion is so rare that I had concluded it was not possible. But your piece, which led me to think you provided, led me to the link you provided, and that link would be your full testimony to the committee. I assume, showed that the pro-choice position can be defended philosophically and intellectually. He goes on to say, I'm not sure what I think now, but I don't mind being uncertain, and I sincerely thank you for your effort to bridge the divide. It's a pretty powerful response from someone who said they've been pro-life their entire life.
Frankly, I was thrilled to get the email because that reader totally got kind of where I was coming from. And not every Christian believes that personhood begins at conception. And for my own faith journey, it wasn't, it is a difficult issue. And what kind of started me to crystallize my own position was a conversation I had with a dear friend from church many years ago. And she told me what the Bible says in Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 to 24. It says that if a pregnant woman is struck and hit by someone and she dies, then the offender will have to pay with his life. These are the verses that talk about a life for a life, an eye for an eye, punishment should equal the harm that was caused. But then the next verse that talks about if a woman is struck and she doesn't die, but has a miscarriage, then the offender has to pay a fine to the amount of which would be whatever the judge and her husband agree on. And pro-life people sometimes will kind of nitpick at that interpretation, but I have read 36 different interpretations, and they do vary, as interpretations will from one another, but the underlying meaning of it is kind of what I've already explained.
Mm-hmm.
So
I guess, interpretations of the Bible passages are hotly debated. But in your studies of Exodus or anything else on your faith journey, have you found any decisive basis in Scripture to support that the absolute stance that life begins at conception or that abortion is murder?
Well, I've gone on to do reading, and I read pro-life books, but I also read pro-choice Christian points of view. And one book in particular is by Margaret Kemisuka, and she's a scholar, and she really makes a good case that there really isn't definitive explanation. Well, evidence. I'll back up a little bit. For one thing, I also found out, if you look at the history of the church, the early popes and some of the other early leaders like St. Augustine and St. Sir Thomas Aquinas, they did not believe personhood happened at the point of conception. They believed it happened at the quickening, and the quickening means the point where a pregnant woman can first feel fetal movement inside her.
Okay.
And many mainline Protestant denominations have issued proclamations in the last 40 years that are pro-choice. And the mainstream belief of Jewish, the mainstream Jewish religious belief is that personhood begins at birth. And then later, I learned more from the hearing. There was a Muslim woman who came, and she said there's unanimous consensus among Muslim religious scholars that in the Islamic tradition, that ensoulment takes place 120 days after conception. And then in visiting with my office mate, who is Native American, Representative Victor, she told me that Native American people in their faith traditions believe personhood happens at birth. So, and even former First Lady Barbara Bush, her biographer was going back through her personal diaries as she was writing the biography, and she came across what Barbara Bush thinks about the issue. And I've got it here. Barbara Bush wrote, these are her words, "When does the soul enter the body is the number one question." So the question is, does life begin at conception or at the moment the first breath is taken? How do I feel about abortion? Having decided that the first breath is when the soul enters the body, I believe in federally funded abortion. So, so that I think that's a legitimate point of view, and yes, there is pushback to that interpretation.
But it goes back to Exodus, right? When God, is that Exodus when God breathed life into Adam and Eve?
Yeah, pro-life Christians differ from pro-choice Christians, but maybe there's a tiebreaker in that we're not the only stakeholders
Mm-hmm.
in biblical scripture. There's another group of people whose faith is also based on the Old Testament, and that is those who are Jewish faith. And I mentioned that before. Traditional Jewish law holds that a fetus does not have the status of personhood, and yes, it's based on key verses, and the Exodus verse is one of them. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it would make sense then that the baby doesn't take its first breath until it's born.
Yes.
So then that's when God would breathe the life into the child after birth.
Yeah, there's a verse in Genesis that's really beautiful in its imagery. It's chapter 2, verse 7. It says, the Lord God formed man of dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. That's another one that I think is the basis for the Jewish belief. But rather than devolve into my interpretation versus your interpretation,
right,
there's a bigger point I'd like to make, which is, for me, it's actually not, that's all comforting to me, but there was even a bigger rationale to me to choose to be pro-choice, and that is religious arguments can inform our position, but I don't think that religious arguments alone can decide it, not legally. Let me think. Yeah, but as you were kind of referring to too, first of all, there's a lack of solid, undeniable scriptural basis for an absolute stance that abortion is murder. And there's different interpretations, and there's no consensus that life begins at conception. There's too much reasonable doubt. And when I say there's too much reasonable doubt, then that takes me into my other rationale, which is the law in the US really weighs heavy on the side of innocence for the accused. Think about it, if you have a jury trial, all 12 members of that jury have to believe there's a reasonable doubt for there to be a conviction. It can't be just a majority or 11-1, it has to be 12. So, and when we're talking about guilt, the burden of proof is on the government. And as a lawmaker, before I can endorse the government placing restrictions on the freedom of a woman to choose her own reproductive care, the freedom of a woman in a situation like the stories that the OBGYNs told about, where she's in dire need of critical health care and she can't choose it, I have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that's the right thing to do, and I'm not there. You can't prove in a tangible way that souls even exist. So that's where I end up on that. It's when there's too much reasonable doubt, let's leave the power with the individual and not have government impose its will.
Agreed. And what about in cases, we talked about not even, reasonable doubt for personhood, but also in self-defense or the safety of the mother. What about, I've heard arguments as it relates to the Second Amendment.
Okay. Yes. I think that having the exception there to save the life of another is so critical. I mean, the first part, you can kind of debate personhood, whether it's there or not. But when you get to that second half, I agree that actually that you can start thinking of the fetus more as a baby, but then whatever the circumstances, there was another story about another doctor told about the fetus had a lethal diagnosis, but if she waited and gave birth to it, she chose to have an abortion because then the baby would experience pain. Whereas she took the baby, if they took it earlier in the pregnancy, then the baby would be comfortable. It would grow the neuron receptors to experience the pain. It would be better for the baby, even though she wasn't ready to not be pregnant. She wanted to wait personally and hold the baby and have that experience for herself. But she realized the unselfish choice was to do what was best for the baby. I mean, if you really think about it. Women have died when denied an abortion. There was a woman in Ireland who died. I think this is the prime example because, her name was Salvita Haplap Panavar, I think. Anyway, she and her husband, living in Ireland in 2012. She was 17 weeks pregnant and she experienced back pain. She went to the hospital to have help. And when she was there after midnight, her water broke, but the fetus did not come out. And then the story kind of gets more complicated. They sent her home, she came back, they sent her home again. Well, the staff at the time at the hospital did not give her the option of an abortion because she developed an infection and really needed one, but they couldn't because it was against Irish law at the time. So the infection got worse. She had a cardiac arrest. And she died at the age of 31. But that's not where her story ends, because her death became the focal point of public outrage in Ireland, and it grew. And ultimately, in 2018, Ireland, which is a state that, it's a country that is 78% Catholic, they voted to repeal their law. So now, to allow patients access to a free and legal abortion, if the pregnancy isn't past 12 weeks. So it's not like a complete opening up, but it's a huge change for Ireland. And it wasn't close. It was a vote of 66.4% to 33.6. So it's 2/3.
That's astonishing.
And that's a country that has lived with a total ban that the pro-life advocates in this country are shooting for. So, yeah.
Well, Representative Lusk, thank you so much. This is, as I mentioned earlier, and as you know, this is such a complex topic that we could probably talk. I could at least discuss this with you for hours because there's a lot of information I know that you have, and you've been fighting the pro-Christian, pro-choice side, which really made me think. So I'd really like to invite you to come back at some point so that we can finish our discussion.
Yeah. There's another argument that the pro-life folks are using about now, just besides the religious argument, which is about science. And I would love to delve into that. I knew there wasn't time there. Would there be, I do think there's one argument I have where there's maybe some area for agreement. If I could share that real quickly.
Oh, please do.
Okay. And I kind of call it the self-defense argument.
Okay.
So if a person is in an active shooter situation, dangerous situation, and that person has a right to make a determination if the other person is actually a lethal threat to them or to their person, and they have the right to choose. whether or not to use lethal force, even to the point of taking the life of the other person. They can kill a person. Because it's a right of self-defense. So why shouldn't the women, as I've described in the OBGYN stories, who are facing a pregnancy condition that threatens their life, have the same self-determination, the same right of self-defense to save their own lives? And to think about it quickly, one more other way is Second Amendment defenders don't trust government with their gun rights. And pro-choice women don't trust government with their reproductive rights.
Right.
And I would love to come back and
I would love to get into that more because I find that very interesting. I find that a very interesting topic. I'd love to talk more about, the science, scientific approach, as well as the self-defense approach that you're talking about.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for being on. Thank you for serving Kansas. And I look forward to speaking with you soon, Representative Lusk. And I do want to mention one more time, I'm astonished still, the email that you received. You were able to, I wouldn't go as far as to change someone's mind. I'm going to show that one more time, but to open someone's mind and show that the pro-choice position can be defended philosophically and intellectually. And I might add from the pro-Christian perspective. So I do appreciate your work and everything that you're doing.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. All right. And thank you everyone one more time for joining us. Please remember to visit mainstreamcoalition.org to learn more about how you can make an impact in this year's elections. One way is to walk with us. Due to the pandemic, Walk the Vote is going online. And this year it's a week-long event, but we are capping it off with a huge virtual walk on June 13th. It'll be a real walk virtually in communities all across Kansas. It's more than just a fundraiser for Mainstream. It's a movement, and it's an opportunity for you to advocate for the issues that are most important to you and your family. So please learn more and register today at walkthevote.org. Stay safe out there, and remember to please do more than vote with Mainstream in 2020.